Olen, Oscar. Okay, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Great. Thank you so much for being here. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, but just for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jennifer Wilcox, and I'm a professor in chemical engineering and energy policy here at Penn, housed both in the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy and also the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. And super excited today to welcome our speaker, Professor Niall McDowell, who's joining us from Imperial College of London. And we're going to dive deeply into what net zero really means. And for those of you in the audience, I think you're here and you're motivated, excited about climate and work in climate. You also realize that IPCC makes it really clear that in order to achieve our climate goals, it's going to take a portfolio. There's no silver bullet. And a critical tool in that portfolio is carbon management. And carbon management includes carbon capture and storage. It includes taking CO2 out of the atmosphere from the accumulated CO2. And the question is, when we think about net zero, is what does it really mean? Is it just CO2? Do we mean other greenhouse gases? Is fossil part of the equation at the end of the day? Or are we just really thinking about wind, water, solar? And what's the role that nuclear plays? And at the end of the day, who's going to pay for this? And so we're going to unpack a lot of that today in Niall's presentation. And a little bit of a bio. I mentioned he's a professor at Imperial. He's a professor of energy systems engineering. He's a chartered engineer and a fellow of both IChemE and the Royal Society of Chemistry. His research is focused on understanding the transition to a low carbon economy. He's published more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers, technical reports, and books on this context. He also has been working in this space of carbon management for 2 decades now. And he's worked in a range of private sector organizations spanning from energy industry to the financial sector, and more recently, an advisor to the government of the UK. And he's been a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of Total Energies, the Norwegian CCS Research Center, and Joule. And he was a member of the US National Petroleum Council CCUS Roadmap Team, and as well as the Technical Working Group of Zero Emissions Platform and the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. And he acts as an advisor to a number of venture capital, private equity funds, and global banks. And so very excited for Niall to get started. And I'm so honored to be able to introduce him because we've been friends and colleagues working in this space for almost 2 decades now. So Niall, with that.
So thank you very much, Jen. And it's a real privilege and honor for me to have the chance to come here and speak with you guys on this. As Jen's intro remarks, I guess, alluded to, you know, I've been doing an awful lot of CCS, carbon capture and storage stuff for about 20 years. And so this is where, you know, people kind of pigeonhole me and say, okay, well, he wants to talk about why fossil fuels are going to be really important and they're not going to go away, and we will just put CCS on every tailpipe and we'll bolt them to the back of your trucks, and you know, that's how we will save the world, right? And that's really not what I want to talk about. And it's weird to me that we sort of arrived into this paradigm where I am for fossil and therefore I am against renewables, or I'm for renewables and therefore I'm against nuclear and so on. And that's really not, I think, a helpful way to think about this. And I think we do need to start thinking more seriously about this net zero climate management challenge. And just a little bit more about my background. So I started out, you know, I'm a chemical engineer. I did my PhD in molecular physics at Imperial College. And, you know, I thought, are we good? Yeah? No? Yes? All right. So I thought, you know, all I need to do is get the best molecule that will, for capturing CO2 or whatever, and, you know, I'll save the world with my molecule. And yeah, pulling on that piece of string for 2 decades, because once you've got a molecule that's decent, it's got to be used in something, this carbon capture process. And this carbon capture process needs to be integrated with a power plant or a cement plant or whatever. And then that power plant is part of a grid, which is being pushed around by all the rest of the things that are in the grid. And then this grid is also being pushed around by, well, what's the global oil price or gas price? And you hear in the US, you guys are lucky, it's very cheap. In the UK, not so cheap. You know, that matters. But also it depends on what the wind's doing, what the sun is doing. All of these things matter. And then how much of these things we have in the grid, this is basically a policy decision. How it gets delivered is ultimately 20 years ago, my molecule weren't really doing very much use at all. It's sort of the journey that I've come on. So maybe to start with, right? I mean, I feel like this is coming and going a lot. Is it me? Probably. Yeah, but is it because I'm not speaking into it properly? So, you know, we've been talking about this climate question really for a very long time. I mean, you guys have all seen these curves where, you know, not very much was happening in terms of fossil carbon emissions to the atmosphere for, you know, for a long time. And then we had, you know, the Industrial Revolution. And then since then, it's all, you know, it's all kicked off. So, you know, it's interesting to know, you go back to the 1770s and people started asking, well, hang on a second, you know, this is sort of at the time when we were asking questions like, you know, why is the sky blue and why don't we all freeze? And well, hang on a second, if we get heat from the sun and the sun goes away at nighttime, why don't we all freeze? Right? You know, this is the sort of the era of these really big questions. And so this first chap, de Saussure, Horace, I think his first name was, you know, was doing these hot box experiments, just, you know, nothing that we would recognize as being terribly rigorous today, but, well, hang on a second, you know, I can see how something is trapping heat, what's going on. And then later, Pouillet, he was postulating, well, hang on a second, maybe it's the CO2 in the water in the air that's trapping this heat in some way, shape, or form. And then famously thereafter, Newton Fudd, and I always talk about John Tyndall because he was also Irish, you know, they independently confirmed that, yeah, no, there are these greenhouse gases. CO2 is one and actually is probably the most potent of what they were evaluating then. You know, so CO2 is a greenhouse gas, it traps heat. Okay, that's interesting. And then later, so Svante, so he was unfortunately going through a divorce and, you know, very upset. And he had a very long winter in Sweden, I think, to work through. So he was doing calculations with a pen and paper, basically looking at, well, as we burn fossil carbon, as we burn coal at that back in those days, and you put it into the atmosphere, and then with this kind of greenhouse gas effect that we've kind of understood, I mean, he had a sort of lattice framework of the entire planet, built up this model that, you know, thought about, well, as population grows, as energy consumption grows, this is how much carbon we'll put into the atmosphere, and this is how we will change the temperature. And his predictions were pretty correct, right? This was being put out there back then. And, you know, yeah, this was being reaffirmed. And I like to sort of think of this period, you know, up until the end of the 19th century, more or less, as, you know, the start of developing a sort of theoretical framework for understanding this space, because thereafter, in the early 20th century, Guy Callendar, so he was, I think, kind of unfairly referred to as an amateur scientist. He was you know, he worked on engines and things like that, but he started noticing a warming trend just by looking at weather reports and temperature reports. You know, not systemic, but some evidence starts to appear. Obviously, you guys will have heard of David Charles Keeling, started measuring, you know, more rigorously the concentration of CO2 in Hawaii. Nice work if you can get it. But then this and other pieces of evidence led President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, to, you know, put it out in public, you know, see, anthropogenic climate change, it's real, it's harmful, we should do something about it. You know, let's get stuck in. Margaret Thatcher thereafter contrived to get it into the agenda of the G7 back then. You know, we need to do something about this climate question. What are we going to do? Led to the Rio Earth Summit, then the Rio +20, and then finally Paris, right? And so this, to me, you know, it's really quite important to sort of set this out because we have been talking about this for a very long time. And I can get, you know, you can then get very frustrated because somewhere in the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, we wasted an awful lot of time looking for perfect certainty, right? Are we absolutely certain that it's humans, that it's us, that it'll be bad, that it'll be worse than doing something else? Shouldn't we just do adaptation? All of these things. I mean, you know, if somebody's busy drilling holes in the bottom of your boat as you're going across the Atlantic, maybe you tell them to stop. Don't wait until the boat starts to sink, right? But that's what we did. We got to Paris, and everybody was very excited, and justifiably so, because this was a huge deal. You get 200 countries to agree to something. That's phenomenally good, right? And I always think that this is very, I want to keep holding this. Yeah, This is absolutely justified that they were very excited, but I always think that the chap on the end has his fingers crossed behind his back because he knows that, yeah, we've agreed to do something, but it's going to be profoundly difficult, right? And understanding, okay, so we're going to do it, but what will climate change cost us? What will the harm be? How do we quantify this? How do we start thinking about cost-benefit analyses, these kinds of things? Because ultimately, this is what it all comes down to, right? We need to, people keep asking, what will it cost us? What can we spend? Is it worth it? And so on. Think two things. A, it's hugely uncertain. It's only very recently, I think, that we got some evidence from the IPCC saying more likely than not, it will cost more to do adaptation than it will to do mitigation. But this is not sort of hugely certain. This is still kind of up in the air a little bit. So it's more likely than not that mitigation will cost more than adaptation, but not 100% clear. And that matters too, because money needs to get spent. 2019, the UK was the first major economy to commit to a legally binding target, net zero by 2050. And by 2023, almost 90%, and it doesn't matter how you slice this, whether it's emissions, population, or GDP, globally, almost 90% of the world was covered by some kind of pledge, commitment, target, goal, et cetera. So there is this sort of momentum building up, which is great, right? It's important to recognize that different countries are doing this in their own way and at different paces. Britain, Europe, we're aiming for 2050. But you can look, for example, China, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Russia, maybe, 2060, India, 2070. And I'll get into this in a little bit more detail later, but in 2023, I was doing quite a bit of work with the World Bank and spent a fair amount of time in South Asia. And when you start to tell people down there that actually, guys, we got to get rid of coal, IPCC says so, they get quite irate, right? They don't like being told what to do. And going back to Jen's opening remarks, I mean, when we talk about net zero, what exactly do we mean? I mean, this term has become so ubiquitous, it's almost meaningless, right? But when you then ask people what exactly are they talking about, it's very difficult to get people to actually agree. Some people think it's zero. Forget the net, it's zero greenhouse gas. Maybe net zero. Maybe it's just zero carbon. So no fossil carbon, or just no carbon at all, so that rules out biomass too, for example. Maybe we can have no fossil carbon, bit of biomass, maybe, but we like nuclear, we like renewables. Or maybe we just like renewable energy, right? And all of these things matter because if you try to design a system at the top level to be net zero greenhouse gas versus, let's say, only wind, water, and solar, you're going in profoundly different directions, right? And this matters. Back in 2014, so this is another good colleague of Jen and mine, Sabina Foos. So she led some work thinking about different pathways to get to Paris, right? And you can see on the primary y-axis, on the x-axis, time, primary y-axis, how much in billions of tons carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere from fossil fuels and from cement, right? Back in 2015, we're on that black line. And what it gets us to is that, in order to get into this sort of blue space at the end of the century, we need to be removing quite a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere. Today, unfortunately, we're close to 40 billion tons every year, right? So we are not on the blue track. But what this means that in order to get to something resembling the Paris Agreement, we are removing from the atmosphere by the end of the century something on the order of 20 billion tons per annum. So half as much as we currently emit. Another way of saying that is we need to create a new industry that is approximately half the size of the total global economy today over the course of the next 75 years. 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide, that's 4 to 5 times the total scope 1 and 2 emissions of the global oil and gas industry today. It's very, very big, right? And we do need to get started. The other thing to kind of say on this is that humans are profoundly good at taking carbon out of the geosphere and putting it into the atmosphere. Starting from the Industrial Revolution, I mean, whether it's wars, pandemics, depressions, recessions, more wars, energy crises, 9/11 happened, the global financial crisis, COVID pandemic, all of these things at the time were sort of epoch-defining events. Didn't get in the way, not nearly. I also think it's really interesting to look at what happened during the COVID pandemic, right? we shut down the planet, basically. We weren't flying, we weren't doing anything, everyone was staying home. And it made, you can see the blip, right? That's not nothing, but it's a blip. And we need to get that number, we need that blip to go down to zero and stay there. So COVID, I think, was a really interesting experiment in how much you can achieve with behavioral change alone. Not nearly enough, almost insignificant, I would say. And I would also say that it is profoundly difficult to convince people to change their behavior and persist with that change. We had this, at least in the UK, we were told there's this disease out there. If you go outside, if you don't obey these rules, if you go outside, you mix with people, you'll get it. It'll kill you. It'll kill your family. It'll kill your friends. It'll kill your grandparents. Stay home. Still, people wanted to go outside. Convincing people to change their behavior, really, really hard. The other thing then, we often frame this as a kind of energy trilemma, right? So you've got sort of, sustainability, you've got energy equity or availability, and you've got energy security. And these are sort of through this trilemma lens, we need all three of these things. We need to balance them. We need them all at the same time, right? Has everyone here seen this sort of lens before? Has anyone not seen it? Right, 1, 2, 3, okay. Majority have seen, some haven't. Would anyone disagree with this framing? Does everyone agree that, we need to balance security, affordability, and sustainability? They're all equally important. Anyone disagree? No, one? Well, what do you think it means? Sorry. Okay. I would say you could frame it as both, right? Because if you have conflict, well, since this is being recorded, I'm going to behave myself. But there's an ongoing conflict in Europe, right, which significantly affected energy security of at least our continent, right? So they're trying to deconvolute those, I think, is very challenging. But just to kind of keep moving on this, I disagree with that. I think there's no evidence that we are actually viewing this in this way. And rather, I think it's much more of a hierarchy, right? We absolutely must have energy security, and we want it to be available 24/7, 365. We don't care where it comes from, we don't care what it costs, and we don't care how much it pollutes. We must have energy. Proof point. When things got tricky in Europe a couple of years ago, gas imports into Germany, the Nord Stream blew up, gas imports went away. They turned back on the coal plants. Just overnight, immediately, turn them back on. There is no discussion. We stopped burning gas in turbines, started using fuel oil instead, because you could put some fuel oil in there to keep things going. There was no discussion about, but carbon, keep the lights on, keep the industry going. We must do that first, right? Then we want it to be affordable, because you got to be able to have affordable energy in order to have an industrial economy. And we would like it to come from reliable places. And once we have those things, and it's affordable and cheap and all the rest of it, then we will start worrying about the clean air, et cetera. And this is borne out by basically every conversation I've had with governments around the world. This is the land. It's got to be affordable. It's got to be secure. It's got to be sustained. And then we will worry about the sustainability piece. It's also then, this is sort of a talk brought to you by Our World in Data, right? But it's also instructive to look at just how our energy use has evolved over time. Back in the sort of 19th century thereabouts, we were overwhelmingly using biomass, wood, right? Chopping down trees, et cetera, depending on where you are in the world. You still use biomass different ways. Then, industrial revolution that we all talk about, we got into coal. Then finally, we're still in the oil age. What's interesting and what's important about this is that every one of these sort of additions of energy, it was because this new energy source, it didn't displace, right? Having coal didn't make us stop using wood. Having oil didn't displace coal and so on, not really. But B, it was brought in because actually this is better. So why we started, at least in Britain, why we started using oil back in sort of the early 1900s. It was very simple. We had, Britain had a big navy-ish at the time. But our strategic competitor was the Germans. The Germans started running their battleships instead of on coal, they started running them on oil. Oil-fired ships go faster than coal-fired ships. In order to retain our strategic position, their strategic position, I should say, First Lord of the Admiralty then, Winston Churchill, right, we're going for oil. And in order to maintain security of supply, because security of energy supply is deeply enmeshed with national security, we will have to have diversity, because at that time we didn't know about oil in the North Sea. We had to get it in from lots of places all around the world. What's also interesting about this, I think, is that we use more biomass, more wood, et cetera, today in the world than we did in the year 1800. We have never used less of anything. And this is primary energy consumption, right? So one of you smart folks, probably this dude, is going to be telling me, yeah, but that's wrong, because when you think about primary energy, most of that gets thrown away because engines are very inefficient. This is done on the substitution method to account for that inaccuracy.
Less common sense.
Say that again?
You use less common sense.
The other piece then about that is, this sort of the evolution of this energy mix. It takes time, right? So historically, it's taken, sort of 40, 50 years for a new energy source to go from 1% to 10% of our economy. And you can see how just this thing takes time. One can then argue that, from the perspective of managing climate change, we don't have the time to wait 40, 50 years. We need to think about how we can expedite this further. But historically, these things have taken time. As I mentioned, the history of this has been overwhelmingly one of adding more. It's more and more and more energy, never coal substituting wood, oil substituting coal, and so on. So that also arguably needs to be changed. We then talk about, where the CO2 comes from. So, it's people talk a lot about, well, okay, the US has peaked, Britain has peaked, Europe has peaked, but all the emissions are coming from China. Unless we have a rapprochement somehow with China on this question, it doesn't really matter. At the same time, however, we think about per capita energy, CO2 emissions, the picture changes somewhat, right? Maybe it's unfair to kind of think about gross, because, well, it's 1.5 billion Chinese, only 300, 400, 500 million Americans. I'm not sure what the number is. 350? Sorry? 4, okay. But, China's bigger than more people in China than there are in the United States. So maybe on a per capita basis is a way to think about that. But then the other piece is that an awful lot of the, national emissions in China, because they're making stuff which we consume, right? So the carbon consumption lens then becomes really important as well. And then at some point, we'll get to talk about things like CBAM, or what's being called in the United States. So CBAM in Europe stands for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Is that good or not depends on where you're standing. In the US, you've got something called the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which could be thought of as a tariff. That's a popular word these days. So it could be thought of as a carbon tariff for higher carbon intensity goods that are being imported into the country. It's also then really important to think about, and this is one of those talks which I really don't like, because I spend all of my time kind of setting out the problems and the challenges and the roadblocks, and not a whole lot of time on the solutions. But maybe the next time I come back. You've got 1 billion people using all of the energy, and 7 billion people around the world using much, much less energy. That's a problem that needs to be addressed. And addressing this problem is deeply enmeshed in all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals as well. And so then if we think about how population is evolving, population is not increasing in sort of Britain, Europe, United States. It's increasing in Asia and Africa. Now, on the one hand, that doesn't matter too much, because you've got all these people who are today not using any energy. If you add some more of them, it doesn't really change the energy consumption piece. But once they start then coming up the development curve using more and more energy services, that's when the picture starts to change. And this is then important because, if you imagine, right, where India, so for example, Britain, Europe, United States, on average, I mean, it varies between Britain and the United States quite a bit, but on average, it's something like 13 barrels of oil per person, right? In China, it's a number that looks a bit like 4. So if Africa and India, for example, were to just get up to a China level, So not a America level or a Britain, Europe level. And again, there's reasons why that may or may not happen. But if they were to go there, that would add another 20 million barrels of oil per day to global demand, right? So just getting to China, another 20 million. So there are two questions then to follow. A, is that a lot? Do we need to worry? Could we do that? And B, well, hang on a second, we're doing electric vehicles, and in many respects, EVs are better. So won't that just mitigate this? So roughly speaking, we consume about 100 million barrels of oil a day. So an increase of 20% is a lot, right? That's the first thing. So thinking about how that gets served, important. And then EVs, so maybe electric vehicles can displace the demand for gasoline, so it's a fraction, but it doesn't obviously displace the demand for all of the other products. So how does that happen? Replacing the whole barrel of oil is a perennial research problem that I'm sure many of you are working on it in some way, shape, or form. And then, so just moving on then, thinking about then what will happen to energy demand going forward. This whole thing, predictions are difficult, especially when you're trying to predict the future. On the one hand, you've got this sort of IEA prediction from the famous net zero emission scenario. Everything's going to peak. We don't need any new energy, anything. Bizarrely, OPEC have a different view. So the IEA's NZE scenario, they predict huge declines in coal, oil, natural gas, all fossil fuels. The amount of that we're going to use, it's just going to crash very significantly and very quickly. The only thing that the OPEC guys agree with is that we're going to crash the amount of coal that we use, but everything else is going to go up. My take on this, for what it's worth, is OPEC are solving one problem. How do we meet energy needs? Parentheses, maybe give a little bit of help to oil and gas. IEA are saying, how do we get to net zero by global net zero by 2050? They are solving different problems and and thus get to very different answers. I would argue that what the world is solving for is much closer to the OPEC view of the world than the IEA view of the world. IEA and OPEC both agree that coal is going to go away. As I mentioned, I was in Indonesia, India, etc., for quite a lot of 2023. And just generally in South and Southeast Asia. The quickest way to get an energy minister of any one of these countries to essentially threaten you physically is to start telling them that what they need to do is stop using coal. This is just not on their agenda. They will tell you that, yes, climate, environment, etc., this is something we care about, but it's very subordinate to our other concerns around energy security, economic growth, providing more services to our economy, etc. It also really matters that they don't have an awful lot, they don't have supply chains for producing and deploying renewable energy or nuclear power in that part of the world. They don't have their own technologies. They don't have massive indigenous resources of oil and gas, not significant. So what is driving their thinking is, yes, we will move from running gasoline engines, from internal combustion engines, to using EVs, because we can buy those cheaply from the Chinese, and we'll power them with coal. That's a great idea, right? Because it shunts all the pollution out of the city, gets it off the streets. We'll put these coal plants somewhere else, and we get to use our own resources, so it's good for our economy, it keeps people employed, and it's good for our energy security. And this is very much this commanding heights of the economy style of government. It's how they think about it. What's also kind of, and again, this is sort of not new, right? It's been bouncing around for a while, but in the last couple of years, you see this real tension between, again, trying to think of how to say this politely, but one view of the world where all that matters is energy security, and another view of the world where actually we also got to manage the climate, right? And it is correct, so in this particular letter from the Congress to Dr. Birol, it is correct, right? IEA have stopped prioritizing energy security because they had their mandate changed. They used to be an energy security organization. They are now a climate management organization plus energy security. In principle, they're trying to manage both. But this does become a political football, and certainly, it's obviously manifest. It's an issue here in the United States, but it's also an issue increasingly it's an issue in the UK and also in Europe. I want to now pivot a little bit and just talk about how we get energy and what it costs and where it comes from. So on the right-hand side, I think this is from IRENA. So the sort of the LCOE numbers, levelized cost of electricity numbers from the International Renewable Energy Organization. And you're all, I'm sure, familiar with the narrative of how solar panels are super cheap and they're, the module prices are crashing all the time. And the LCOE is very cheap and so on and so forth. The issue is that to be really simplistic and reductionist about it, the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't always blow, right? That's the first problem. The second problem is that whilst the sun does what the sun does pretty much all the time, that's hugely predictable. The wind is much less so. And so what you can see, for example, this top blue line, or the top blue dot, this is the capacity factor for wind across 20 years, right? And you can see how this varies quite significantly. 1 year there was a very low wind year, right? In order to run an economy, you have to have 24/7, 365 for all years energy. And so then the question is, how do you be resilient to that? So, one of the questions we tried to tackle was, if what I want to do is have 20 years of just baseload power from wind, solar, batteries, accounting for all of that inter and intra-annual variability, how much overcapacity do I need to build? And what's it going to cost? And we took sort of the baseline cost numbers from, I think it was Lazard. And, again, World Bank style, what's the cost of financing as you move around the world? We did this sort of for, I think, 14,000 node points around the planet. And this is a selection. So on the primary y-axis, you see the capacity of stuff we had to build in terms of generating capacity. And then on the secondary y-axis, is how much energy storage, I think. And then on the tertiary y-axis is how much it costs. And then along the x-axis, lots of different places, right? Now, we were asking for baseload. We weren't asking for the cheapest megawatt hours, right? And what sort of jumped out at me is like, hang on a second, everywhere wants an awful lot of sun because that predictability really matters, right? It varies very significantly around the world, but notably on that primary y-axis, how much capacity do we need to build? None of those numbers look anything close to 1, right? You need to build a lot of stuff in order to get to a baseload level of power, right? Now, this is a ridiculously stern test, right? 24/7, 365 for 20 years. Surely we could have something a bit more relaxed. But if you want to have a like-for-like comparison between, say, a nuclear plant or a gas plus CCS plant and renewables, this is one way to do it, okay? And let's say that I'm wrong and cut these numbers in 2, right? Still doesn't look terribly cheap. And this isn't to say that renewable energy doesn't have an important role to play, but I'm really struggling to understand how tying our economy to whether or not the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, tying it to the weather, how that's a clever thing to do. And particularly in Europe, for example, Britain and Europe, increasingly that, by the way, means gas. So when we have cold snaps where the wind isn't blowing, what this really means is our gas prices are going up next quarter, right? We need to think more seriously about our energy security. The other piece, and I thought that this was a clever idea, and then Dan Yergin did a whole thing on it, but in order to build all of this renewable energy stuff, you have to mine an incredible amount of new material. Now, the criticism or the reason why we don't need to worry about this so much is once you've done the mining has been done, have these materials out, you can recycle them, right? So that's not such a problem. But it is something that we do need to do. And when we then started thinking about, well, okay, how much sort of waste gets produced? Because, you don't get iron ore lying in perfect ingots of iron under the ground, right? It's pretty dilute as a point source. So you produce quite a lot of waste when you're producing all these metals. And when we were sort of working our way through, huge error bars because deposits of ore are very variable and all the rest of it. But one way of thinking of counting up how much waste we would be producing by, because what we're trying to do here is thinking about following through the IPCC and IEA, et cetera, projections of how much wind, solar, batteries, electrolyzers, and so on we'd need, and working this back to how much of the different metals we'd need, what this got us to is Mount Everest equivalents of tailings that would need to be dealt with was the most convenient unit of measurement, right? It's a lot. And today, what we mostly do is we pile that stuff up on the ocean, we pile it up in the land, or we just let it get blown into the atmosphere. If you're making aluminium, for example, you get red mud or bauxite residue. This goes into a lake in places like Brazil, Hungary, et cetera. People end up living close to it. At some point, these lakes burst, people die. It's not very nice. We need to think about how to manage these environmental problems also. The other narrative again that we keep hearing is, renewable energy is getting terribly cheap, and this is sort of very much the kind of picture on the right-hand side, but this stands in tension to the observed cost of power purchase agreements, which have just been going up and can continue to do so. The reality is that the cost of a module in China has nothing got to do with the cost of a PPA in the United States, Britain, Europe, okay? And money is getting more expensive, not less. I mean, fingers crossed we will get to a world where interest rates, please for my mortgage, will start to come back down. But this really matters because what you're doing is you're moving from a world dominated by OpEx, by fuel costs, to one which is dominated by CapEx. Obviously, to state the obvious, as you add tariffs to these things, this adds further dislocation. And we are all busily at the moment breaking this globalized world up into fragments and adding as many barriers as we possibly can, it feels like. Just to kind of now move on and start talking about the importance of affordability and why this matters. I mean, fundamentally, the economy is energy transformed. If you have cheap energy, you can have a robust economy. If you have expensive energy, you cannot. It's, as simple as that. We used to think about, countries like the United States as having a very mature energy system. Power demand was going to grow at a very stately kind of 1% per annum or something like that over time. Very stable, not a big deal. Not anymore, right? AI, big data, et cetera. Power demand is really increasing. This matters. You can go back to the 1930s. Every time that there's been a secular bear market, every time that we've had a recession, it has coincided with expensive energy. Now, obviously, got to be careful. Correlation is not causation and so on and so forth. But these two things are very, very tightly enmeshed. In Europe, winter of 2022, which is, I'll come back to that in a second. This point about affordable energy matters because, well, people get upset by it, put simply. So these are some images from Paris, France, back during what were called the Gilets jaunes or yellow vest protests. This all started, I mean, arguably it evolved into something else, but it started because in pursuit of sort of climate, environmental type goals, the folks in the Élysée Palace thought, let's add a levy to fuel prices to stop people driving their cars and get them out of the car and into the bus. Seems reasonable, right? If you live in Paris with a really good metro. If you live in rural France, and I don't know how much time you guys have spent sort of in Provence and places like that. It's very picturesque, very lovely, no metros, no buses, no anything, right? So all you've really done by adding this tax is make people's lives more difficult and make their existence more tenuous. The French being French, they were very quick to make their feelings on the matter known, and in quite a direct way. Continuing with this theme, so winter 2022, our gas price in Europe went up to, so here in the US, it's something like $4 an MMBTU, $4 an M. In Europe, it was up at about 40, okay? Quite expensive. We put €1 trillion, collected the royal we, all of Europe more or less put €1 trillion into the energy system in one way, shape, or form to shield consumers from that price increase. Prices still went up. My personal bill probably quadrupled, right? That's with €1 trillion shielding you, okay? That's relative to the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. And again, I think this bears repeating. Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion, dollars, euros, all about the same these days. We put in $1 trillion. when the Inflation Reduction Act came out in 2022 as well, right? So not, the Europeans were freaking out because this is unfair, you're over subsidizing, race to the bottom, da 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 da. All the concern went away as soon as we get into a place of energy prices. Why? Well, one reason, it's a very, very brave leader. However, that leader is elected, appointed, selected, et cetera, that will expose their constituents to higher energy prices than they absolutely need to. And B, as this plot shows, when you increase energy prices, people die. At this stage in the Ukraine war, fewer than 10,000 people had died. This mild winter, when we were all kind of patting ourselves on the back and saying, isn't it very lucky we managed to reduce consumption, we didn't run out of gas, we were very lucky it was a mild winter, almost 70,000 people died in Europe because of the cold. Right? So €1 trillion, huge campaign to get people to stop using energy. We lost 70,000 and reduced gas consumption by a seasonally adjusted number of about 10%. Now, if you're a gas markets person, that's really interesting because it sort of tells you that there's maybe a 10% swing in consumption in any given year. But from a climate perspective, we can increase energy prices really significantly. We can push people really, really quite a lot to reduce their energy use, 10% swing, right? So again, COVID taught us behavioral change doesn't get us there. Ukraine wars taught us you can't really reduce prices even by, you can't reduce energy consumption even by very significantly increasing the price, because fundamentally sitting in the cold, dark, eating out of a tin just isn't going to work, right? People need to stay warm, etc. Moving on then, so some folks took the IEA net zero pathway to 2050. How are we doing for time, Jen? Cool, I'll move faster. So took the IEA net zero scenario and tried to think about if we went and did it, what would that amount to? And we got to this number of sort of order 10 trillion, right? Plus or minus. It's quite a lot of money. You put that 10 trillion in the context of the global economy, and it works out at sort of 1.5% or thereabouts. For context, I think the Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project in the US, so Manhattan Project, atomic bomb, Apollo getting to the moon. So missions of strategic national importance, existential, arguably, from the perspective of the administrations at the time, they were able to put about 0.25%. So this is like the global hegemon at the time, unchallenged in any way. They were able to put 0.25% for a short period of time of their national economy to achieve these incredible goals. We are talking about many times that to meet this net zero piece. And I don't want to kind of belabor this point, but historically, investments in green energy just have not performed well, despite all of the kind of enthusiasm around IRA, et cetera. It just hasn't performed. 1.5% is a lot of money. Very few people in NATO, for example, can go anywhere close to that level of spend. And we are now in a paradigm where we are going to have to spend a lot more money in Britain and Europe on defense spending, right? And we can argue the toss as to whether that's right, bad, et cetera, but it's a fact. So where is the money going to come from, and how is it going to get delivered? Just in the interest of time, I'll skip this. It's just more of the, we need to think about how different places use energy. Because again, there is just historically, there is no such thing as a high GDP, low energy consuming society. This bottom right section of that chart is entirely empty. And all of these folks in Burundi and so on, the low income countries are trying to jump up into the lower middle income countries, and lower middle income countries are trying to jump into high income countries. And for entirely legitimate reasons. They want fridges and air conditioners and the ability to watch TV and use light in the evening and possibly drive from A to B and all the rest of it, right? So how do you tell them no? And how dare you tell them no? So this is also something very important. Going back to this concept of how energy use varies around the world. So we had, again, in 2022 Europe, because Europe, kind of climate pioneer and all that kind of stuff. Basically, resolution by the European Parliament, violation of human rights in Uganda and Tanzania, because they had the temerity to go off and start developing their own energy projects, right? The Ugandans have their own response. You can condemn us all, we condemn you for condemning us, stay out of our business. And then, again, and during this energy crisis in Europe, whilst at the same time telling the Ugandans not to develop their own energy sources, Germany in particular, but many Europeans turned up to Africa saying, but we would like to take it for us. We don't want you to develop it for you because you locked yourself in, and that would be bad, but we will take it for us because we need it now. Again, that didn't go down well. And then more recently, Prime Minister of Malaysia sort of started to sum this up in a pretty compelling way, I think, which is, the need for transition. So yes, we recognize this, but we also have other imperatives, and you can't dictate to us. And so to try and get toward a conclusion, and so this is some work we did a couple of years ago in the UK, and it was very much around thinking about the energy transition in particular, and sorry, it's going to come back to CCS now, but particularly in the context of developing CCS projects in Britain. It's, yes, we know it will cost something, but let's think about the value that it can unlock and how value can be created, what sections of the society, what sections of our economy can benefit from this. And when we did this piece of work just for CCS, we concluded that there will be something like a 5-to-1 cost-benefit privilege for investing in this transition, right? So if you then start thinking about it through that lens, this can now stop this from being perceived as exclusively a cost, and we can start thinking about where it actually works to our advantage. So to conclude, we've known about this for a very long time, right? We can't pretend we haven't. I think that we do need to recognize that this is very much a hierarchy. If you don't have energy, you want some, and if you have some, you'll need more, and so on and so forth. We need to be pragmatic. I mean, when I was writing these slides a while ago, I thought I was being clever using this word pragmatic. Everywhere I've been going for the last year or so, people are using this term, right? It's getting overused. National security and geopolitics will trump climate considerations. And when I wrote that, I wasn't trying to make a pun, but it works. Taxpayers, consumers, and investors all have a role to play, right? I think in a lot of the conversations that I've had, whether it's with, from a finance or corporate or government, everyone's sort of saying, well, we think you should do something, and everyone else wants somebody else to do anything, right? Like, I would like to be net zero. Well, okay, great, but what are you going to do about it? We need to have I think empathy is the key here, right? We need to have much greater understanding of what our counterparties can and cannot do. And what we absolutely must do is respect the national sovereignty of other countries, right? And, again, in many, many ways, but we cannot be going into other countries, scolding them and telling them what to do. I think it will require every tool in the shed to continue to keep the lights on, plus meet other emerging energy needs. So this sort of binary choice presentation, we can use this type of energy, but not that type. I think that is a fundamental mistake. And we need to focus on economic growth and value creation. So, and finally, what do we need? Everything, everywhere, all at once. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Niall. And now we have some time for questions of our speaker. And maybe as people are warming up and becoming brave to ask a question, I'll start. When you think about the technologies of carbon capture, and I know that you're helping a little bit, in terms of advising on utilities maybe, and even maybe in some of the industrial sectors for decarbonization, and you spent so much time in Southeast Asia, are you seeing some of the technologies that the global north is being able to kind of demonstrate in a meaningful way, some of those technologies that are also helping out folks in other parts of the globe?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
so maybe I'll start negative and hopefully end positive, right? I was really depressed when I went to some parts of well, particularly India, because they seem to be, yes, we want to do CCS, so they were quite pro, but they wanted to invent it for themselves, right? And they wanted to invent something that would be better than monoethanolamine or, baseline standard technology. And it was partially a sort of, we need to do this ourselves, self-sufficiency motive. Partially, they didn't, come to our conferences, right? So we could do a lot better job at sort of technology transfer and so on, which then bridges nicely to CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in Europe. And on the one hand, this is a fantastic piece of, political economy. We have said we are now willing to pay. We've created a market for low carbon goods and services. This is huge. One of the biggest consuming markets in the world. We are willing to pay more for low carbon products. How this gets perceived in other parts of the world is that's a tariff, that's a barrier, that's a trade barrier, and you are stopping me from selling to you, you're excluding me from your market. That's not fair, right? And so we need to do a lot better at sort of helping other countries understand what technologies will work, how to get them deployed, how to do the finance, all of these things we need to do a lot more. So it's great that we've done the CBAM thing, but now we got to help people move it forward. And I think we can do a lot better on that too.
Makes sense. Okay, Shelby.
Shelby.
Can you say more about the European response to IRA? I feel like I've only ever thought of it from like a United States perspective where like
Sure.
I think of it quite positively, but you said that Europe was like freaking out. I don't know what that means and I want to know more.
You don't know what freaking out means? This is like, generational gaps or something. No, no, but it's a really important point, right? So on the one hand, Europe wants America to do better and so on and so forth, but we didn't mean that good, right? I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act was a huge amount of money, and it also got perceived, right? So hang on a second, there's infinity free money available in America, and all I got to do is turn up, was sort of how it was presented in Europe, right? So everyone with half a brain who wanted to think about carbon management coming to America, right? Let's move our business from London, Paris, Prague, whatever. We'll come to, there's this whole like, you're all leaving, right? At the same time, everyone who's trying to do projects, you're sitting government in London, and everyone who's trying to do a project is saying, well, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to the state. There was this threat, right? But it was quite useful in some senses because then the Europeans, and to a lesser extent, I think maybe the British, were able to then respond with the net zero strategy that I worked on in Britain and the Net Zero Industry Act in Europe, which again is their sort of policy response. It's quite different because the lens over here is in caricature. You get $85 a ton for burying CO2. If you manage to do that for $84.99 or $8 and become profoundly rich, I don't care, well done. In Britain, we will figure out what it costs you to do that and give you a small return through gritted teeth. And if we manage to get one project, we will consider that a success. I mean, this is a bit of a cartoon, right? But the economy of how these things manifest also matters. Does that start to answer your question?
Any more hands? Oh, yes, there are.
In terms of a sort of balanced policy approach, I thought two things you said may sort of summarize the argument that you were making here. One was in the context of China. You were talking about electric vehicles in the city and coal-fired power plants in rural areas, sort of efficiency and pollution, separating those two spatially. And the other was a slide about COVID-19 killing fewer Europeans in 2022-23 than a rise in energy prices. And I think there may have been maybe one piece missing there in terms of policy that maybe ties these together. And that's the idea of pollution and the impact on lives and prices that has. So I'm wondering if you could sort of help me round out the picture of how pollution and energy choice or scrubbing technologies and the inefficiencies in there may play into choices in having an energy balance and which modes of electricity are feeding into the grid.
There's a lot in that. So I think you're basically saying, well, hang on a second, if you put pollution into the atmosphere, you know, that will have a disbenefit because people will be sicker, right? And so I think that there's a good amount of evidence to say that that's so. And by having cleaner air, you have fewer lost days of work and things like that from respiratory illness, and therefore the economy benefits. And so therefore somebody somewhere could spend something to reduce that air pollution. So I think that's correct. I'm not aware of anyone, at least in the UK, making policy on that basis. That would fall under the kind of Department for Transport's purview, and I've not worked with them too much. But at the same time, we are doing things around managing air pollution from vehicles, whether it's, you know, SOx, NOx, particulate matter, things like that. So, but I'm not sure that we're doing it because of that sort of economic argument, so much as this is pollution, it's bad, we should stop. And again, you know, the driving forces, you know, so in sort of Britain/Northern Europe, a lot of the time the narrative is polluting's bad, let's stop. In other parts of the world, it becomes a much more raw cost-benefit analysis, right? So there's a value judgment in there somewhere as well. I mean, that's a very woolly answer to a good question, but.
Question here.
Thank you. So I think one of your last slides was about talking about the value creation of carbon capture and how that's a better argument for getting people on board.
Well, let's say value creation of clean energy technologies, full stop, right?
Okay, yeah. And so I do think that is 100% a better way to persuade people. Like, you're much better off appealing to their interests rather than to their reason to convince people. But I always thought of these technologies as like a huge initial investment that maybe in the long term possibly could have a positive payoff. So could you break down like that graph that you showed in the slide to explain where all the value is coming from?
I'm not sure if I can, but very quickly, right? So somebody has to spend money today, right? So it's a cost for whomever is building the capture plant or whatever it is. But we got to employ people to build the thing. We got to buy reactor vessels and heat exchangers, and you know, you're doing a lot of procurement. That is creating value. You're creating jobs. You're creating activity. A lot of lawyers, a lot of bankers, a lot of consultants also get involved. So you're creating employment today, even though the ROI for the project developer comes later. Every step of the way along the way, you are creating value. The other thing that, sorry, is this going to work? No.
So, oh.
The other thing that we sort of did, excuse me.
Mhm.
So first of all, not polluting, to your point, we said that has some value. Then you're increasing domestic economic activity, so both direct and indirect. So basically, I'm going to hire you to do something, to come and work on at my facility, and then you're going to buy a sandwich off somebody else, right? That's the indirect piece. You'll be manufacturing, like somebody's going to have to make some stuff, right? And so on and so forth. The other piece that's really important is we were thinking the UK has a really good CO2 storage potential. We've got great geology, really shallow part of the North Sea and so on and so forth. We will provide CO2 storage as a service to other countries. So we will get direct revenue coming in. So that's how we stacked it up. Does that make sense? Well, we have a carbon tax, right?
We do not in the United States. But okay, we're going to end on that because we're at time. But I will just say there are boxed lunches, right? It ends at 1? No? Okay. Okay. So there are boxed lunches. If you want to stick around and have lunch and further discussion on this with Niall, we'll be here for another half hour. So there's that. And thank you again, Niall. And as you're picking up and walking out, I'll just let you know too, that you can follow up. This will be online tomorrow afternoon. And also now we'll be doing an energy policy podcast on our Policy Now through Kleinman Center. And then also, I wanted to mention there's a visiting scholar lecture from pastures to policy, livestock practices for regenerative agriculture systems. Register online, and it's here on March 25th. Thanks, everybody. Very much as I